Section 3 of Another Study of Woman by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage, 1865 to 1946, and others. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "You need not owe Napoleon any grudge on that score," said Canalis, with an emphatic tone and gesture. It was one of his weaknesses to be jealous of literary genius, for he had his mean points. Who will ever explain, depict, or understand Napoleon? A man represented with his arms folded, who did everything, who was the greatest force ever known, the most concentrated, the most mordant, the most acid of all forces, a singular genius who carried armed civilization in every direction without fixing it anywhere. A man who could do everything because he willed everything, a prodigious phenomenon of will, conquering an illness by a battle, yet doomed to die of disease in bed after living in the midst of ball and bullets. A man with a code and a sword in his brain, word and deed. A clear-sighted spirit that foresaw everything but his own fall. A capricious politician who risked men by handfuls out of economy, and who spared 3 heads, those of Talleyrand, of Pozzo di Borgo, and of Metternich, diplomatists whose death would have saved the French Empire, and who seemed to him of greater weight than thousands of soldiers. A man to whom nature, as a rare privilege, had given a heart in a frame of bronze, mirthful and kind at midnight amid women, and the next morning manipulating Europe as a young girl might amuse herself by splashing water in her bath. Hypocritical and generous, loving tawdriness and simplicity, devoid of taste, but protecting the arts, and in spite of these antitheses, really great in everything by instinct or by temperament. Caesar at 25, Cromwell at 30, and then, like my grocer buried in Père Lachaise, a good husband and a good father. In short, he improvised public works, empires, kings, codes, verses, a romance, and all with more range than precision. Did he not aim at making all Europe France? And after making us way on the earth in such a way as to change the laws of gravitation, he left us poorer than on the day when he first laid hands on us, while he who had taken an empire by his name lost his name on the frontier of his empire in a sea of blood and soldiers. A man all thought and all action, who comprehended Desaix and Fouché. All despotism and all justice at the right moments, the true king, said de Marsay. Ah, what a pleasure it is to digest while you talk, said Baron de Nucingen. But do you suppose that the treat we are giving you is a common one? Asked Joseph Bridau. If you had to pay for the charms of conversation as you do for those of dancing or of music, your fortune would be inadequate. There is no second performance of the same flash of wit. And are we really so much deteriorated as these gentlemen think? Said the Princesse de Cadignan, addressing the women with a smile at once sceptical and ironical. Because, in these days, under a regime which makes everything small, you prefer small dishes, small rooms, small pictures, small articles, small newspapers, small books. Does that prove that women, too, have grown smaller? Why should the human heart change because you change your coat? In all ages the passions remain the same. I know cases of beautiful devotion, of sublime sufferings, which lack the publicity, the glory, if you choose, which formerly gave lustre to the errors of some women. But though one may not have saved a king of France, one is not the less an Agnès Sorel. Do you believe that our dear Marquise d'Espard is not the peer of Madame Doublet or Madame du Deffand, in whose room so much evil was spoken and done? Is not Taglioni a match for Camargo, or Malibran the equal of Saint Huberti? Are not our poets superior to those of the 18th century? If at this moment, through the fault of the grocers who govern us, we have not a style of our own, had not the Empire its distinguishing stamp as the age of Louis XV had, and was not its splendour fabulous? Have the sciences lost anything? I am quite of your opinion, madame. The women of this age are truly great," replied the Comte de Vandenesse. "When posterity shall have followed us, will not Madame Récamier appear in proportions as fine as those of the most beautiful women of the past? We have made so much history that historians will be lacking. The age of Louis XIV. Had but one Madame de Sévigné. We have 1,000 now in Paris who certainly write better than she did, and who do not publish their letters. Whether the Frenchwoman be called perfect lady or great lady, she will always be the woman among women. Émile Blondet has given us a picture of the fascinations of a woman of the day. But, at need, this creature who bridles or shows off, who chirps out the ideas of Mr. This and Mr. That, would be heroic. And it must be said, your faults, mesdames, are all the more poetical because they must always and under all circumstances be surrounded by greater perils. I have seen much of the world, I have studied it perhaps too late, but in cases where the illegality of your feelings might be excused, I have always observed the effects of I know not what chance, which you may call providence, inevitably overwhelming such as we consider light women." "I hope," said Madame de Vandenesse, "that we can be great in other ways—" "Oh, let the Comte de Vandenesse preach to us!" exclaimed Madame de Serizy. "With all the more reason because he has preached a great deal by example," said the Baronne de Nucingen. "On my honor," said General de Montriveau, "in all the dramas, a word you are very fond of," he said, looking at Blondet, "in which the finger of God has been visible, the most frightful I ever knew was very near being by my act—" "Well, tell us all about it," cried Lady Barrymore. "I love to shudder." "It is the taste of a virtuous woman," replied de Marsay, looking at Lord Dudley's lovely daughter. "During the campaign of 1812," General de Montriveau began, "I was the involuntary cause of a terrible disaster, which may be of use to you, Doctor Bianchon," turning to me, "since while devoting yourself to the human body, you will concern yourself a good deal with the mind, it may tend to solve some of the problems of the will. I was going through my second campaign. I enjoyed danger, and laughed at everything, like the young and foolish lieutenant of artillery that I was. When we reached the Beresina, the army had, as you know, lost all discipline, and had forgotten military obedience. It was a medley of men of all nations, instinctively making their way from north to south. The soldiers would drive a general in rags and barefoot away from their fire if he brought neither wood nor victuals. After the passage of this famous river, disorder did not diminish. I had come quietly and alone, without food, out of the marshes of Zembin, and was wandering in search of a house where I might be taken in. Finding none or driven away from those I came across, happily towards evening I perceived a wretched little Polish farm, of which nothing can give you any idea unless you have seen the wooden houses of Lower Normandy or the poorest farm buildings of La Beauce. These dwellings consist of a single room, with one end divided off by a wooden partition, the smaller division serving as store-room for forage. In the darkness of twilight I could just see a faint smoke rising above this house. Hoping to find there some comrades more compassionate than those I had hitherto addressed, I boldly walked as far as the farm. On going in, I found the table laid. Several officers, and with them a woman, a common sight enough, were eating potatoes, some horseflesh broiled over the charcoal, and some frozen beetroots. I recognized among the company 2 or 3 artillery captains of the regiment in which I had first served. I was welcomed with a shout of acclamation which would have amazed me greatly on the other side of the Beresina, but at this moment the cold was less intense, my fellow officers were resting, they were warm, they had food, and the room, strewn with trusses of straw, gave the promise of a delightful night. We did not ask for so much in those days. My comrades could be philanthropists gratis, one of the commonest ways of being philanthropic. I sat down to eat on one of the bundles of straw. At the end of the table, by the side of the door opening into the smaller room full of straw and hay, sat my old colonel, one of the most extraordinary men I ever saw among all the mixed collection of men it has been my lot to meet. He was an Italian. Now, whenever human nature is truly fine in the lands of the South, it is really sublime. I do not know whether you have ever observed the extreme fairness of Italians when they are fair. It is exquisite, especially under an artificial light. When I read the fantastical portrait of Colonel Oudet, sketched by Charles Nodier, I found my own sensations in every one of his elegant phrases. Italian, then, as were most of the officers of his regiment, which had in fact been borrowed by the Emperor from Eugene's army, my colonel was a tall man, at least 8 or 9 inches above the standard, and was admirably proportioned; a little stout perhaps, but prodigiously powerful, active, and clean-limbed as a greyhound. His black hair in abundant curls showed up his complexion as white as a woman's. He had small hands, a shapely foot, a pleasant mouth, and an aquiline nose delicately formed, of which the tip used to become naturally pinched and white whenever he was angry, as happened often. His irascibility was so far beyond belief that I will tell you nothing about it. You will have the opportunity of judging of it. No one could be calm in his presence. I alone, perhaps, was not afraid of him. He had indeed taken such a singular fancy to me that he thought everything I did right. When he was in a rage, his brow was knit, and the muscles of the middle of his forehead set in a delta, or, to be more explicit, in Redgauntlet's horseshoe. This mark was, perhaps, even more terrifying than the magnetic flashes of his blue eyes. His whole frame quivered, and his strength, great as it was in his normal state, became almost unbounded. He spoke with a soft guttural roll. His voice, at least as powerful as that of Charles Nordier's Oudet, threw an incredible fullness of tone into the syllable or the consonant in which this burr was sounded. Though this faulty pronunciation was at times a grace, when commanding his men, or when he was excited, you cannot imagine, unless you had heard it, what force was expressed by this accent, which at Paris is so common. When the colonel was quiescent, his blue eyes were angelically sweet, and his smooth brow had a most charming expression. On parade, or with the army of Italy, not a man could compare with him. Indeed, d'Orsay himself, the handsome d'Orsay, was eclipsed by our colonel on the occasion of the last review held by Napoleon before the invasion of Russia. Everything was in contrast in this exceptional man. Passion lives on contrast. Hence you need not ask whether he exerted over women the irresistible influences to which our nature yields, and the General looked at the Princesse de Cadignan, as vitreous matter is moulded under the pipe of the glass blower. Still, by a single fatality, an observer might perhaps explain the phenomenon, the colonel was not a lady killer, or was indifferent to such successes. To give you an idea of his violence, I will tell you in a few words what I once saw him do in a paroxysm of fury. We were dragging our guns up a very narrow road, bordered by a somewhat high slope on one side and by thickets on the other. When we were half-way up we met another regiment of artillery, its colonel marching at the head. This colonel wanted to make the captain, who was at the head of our foremost battery, back down again. The captain, of course, refused, but the colonel of the other regiment signed to his foremost battery to advance, and in spite of the care the driver took to keep among the scrub, the wheel of the first gun struck our captain's right leg and broke it, throwing him over on the near side of his horse. All this was the work of a moment. Our colonel, who was but a little way off, guessed that there was a quarrel. He galloped up, riding among the guns at the risk of falling with his horse's 4 feet in the air, and reached the spot face to face with the other colonel at the very moment when the captain fell, calling out, "Help!" No, our Italian colonel was no longer human. Foam like the froth of champagne rose to his lips. He roared inarticulately like a lion. Incapable of uttering a word or even a cry, he made a terrific signal to his antagonist, pointing to the wood and drawing his sword. The two colonels went aside. In 2 seconds we saw our colonel's opponent stretched out on the ground, his skull split in two. The soldiers of his regiment backed, yes, by heaven, and pretty quickly too. The captain, who had been so nearly crushed, and who lay yelping in the puddle where the gun carriage had thrown him, had an Italian wife, a beautiful Sicilian of Messina, who was not indifferent to our colonel. This circumstance had aggravated his rage. He was pledged to protect the husband, bound to defend him as he would have defended the woman herself. Now, in the hovel beyond Zembin, where I was so well received, this captain was sitting opposite to me, and his wife was at the other end of the table, facing the colonel. This Sicilian was a little woman named Rosina, very dark, but with all the fire of the southern sun in her black almond-shaped eyes. At this moment she was deplorably thin. Her face was covered with dust, like fruit exposed to the drought of a high road. Scarcely clothed in rags, exhausted by marches, her hair in disorder, and clinging together under a piece of shawl tied close over her head, still she had the graces of a woman. Her movements were engaging, her small rose mouth and white teeth, the outline of her features and figure, charms which misery, cold, and neglect had not altogether defaced, still suggested love to any man who could think of a woman. Rosina had one of those frames which are fragile in appearance, but wiry and full of spring. Her husband, a gentleman of Piedmont, had a face expressive of ironical simplicity, if it is allowable to ally the two words. Brave and well informed, he seemed to know nothing of the connections which had subsisted between his wife and the colonel for 3 years past. I ascribed this unconcern to Italian manners, or to some domestic secret. Yet there was in the man's countenance one feature which always filled me with involuntary distrust. His under lip, which was thin and very restless, turned down at the corners instead of turning up, and this, as I thought, betrayed a streak of cruelty in a character which seemed so phlegmatic and indolent. As you may suppose, the conversation was not very sparkling when I went in. My weary comrades ate in silence. Of course they asked me some questions, and we related our misadventures, mingled with reflections on the campaign, the generals, their mistakes, the Russians, and the cold. A minute after my arrival, the colonel, having finished his meagre meal, wiped his moustache, bid us good night, shot a black look at the Italian woman, saying, "Rosina?" and then, without waiting for a reply, went into the little barn full of hay to bed. The meaning of the colonel's utterance was self-evident. The young wife replied by an indescribable gesture, expressing all the annoyance she could not feel at seeing her thraldom thus flaunted without human decency, and the offence to her dignity as a woman and to her husband. But there was, too, in the rigid setting of her features and the tight knitting of her brows, a sort of presentiment. Perhaps she foresaw her fate. Rosina remained quietly in her place. A minute later, and apparently when the colonel was snug in his couch of straw or hay, he repeated, "Rosina?" The tone of the second call was even more brutally questioning than the first. The colonel's strong burr, and the length which the Italian language allows to be given to vowels and the final syllable, concentrated all the man's despotism, impatience, and strength of will. Rosina turned pale, but she rose, passed behind us, and went to the colonel. All the party sat in utter silence. I, unluckily, after looking at them all, began to laugh, and then they all laughed too. "Tu ridi?" "You laugh," said the husband. "On my honour, old comrade," said I, becoming serious again, "I confess that I was wrong. I ask your pardon 1,000 times, and if you are not satisfied by my apologies, I am ready to give you satisfaction." "Oh, it is not you who are wrong, it is I," he replied coldly. Thereupon we all lay down in the room, and before long all were sound asleep. Next morning, each one, without rousing his neighbor or seeking companionship, set out again on his way, with that selfishness which made our rout one of the most horrible dramas of self-seeking, melancholy, and horror, which ever was enacted under heaven. Nevertheless, at about 700 or 800 paces from our shelter, we, most of us, met again, and walked on together, like geese led in flocks by a child's wilful tyranny. The same necessity urged us all. Having reached a knoll where we could still see the farmhouse where we had spent the night, we heard sounds resembling the roar of lions in the desert, the bellowing of bulls. No, it was a noise which can be compared to no known cry. And yet, mingling with this horrible and ominous roar, we could hear a woman's feeble scream. We all looked round, seized by I know not what impulse of terror. We no longer saw the house, but a huge bonfire. The farmhouse had been barricaded and was in flames. Swirls of smoke borne on the wind brought us hoarse cries and an indescribable pungent smell. A few yards behind, the captain was quietly approaching to join our caravan. We gazed at him in silence, for no one dared question him. But he, understanding our curiosity, pointed to his breast with the forefinger of his right hand, and waving the left in the direction of the fire, he said, "Son io." We all walked on without saying a word to him. "There is nothing more terrible than the revolt of a sheep," said de Marsay. "It would be frightful to let us leave with this horrible picture in our memory," said Madame de Montcornet. "I shall dream of it. And what was the punishment of Monsieur de Marsay's first?" said Lord Dudley, smiling. "When the English are in jest, their foils have the buttons on," said Blondet. "Monsieur Bianchon can tell us, for he saw her dying," replied de Marsay, turning to me. "Yes," said I, "and her end was one of the most beautiful I ever saw. The Duke and I had spent the night by the dying woman's pillow. Pulmonary consumption, in the last stage, left no hope. She had taken the sacrament the day before. The Duke had fallen asleep. The Duchess, waking at about 4 in the morning, signed to me in the most touching way, with a friendly smile, to bid me leave him to rest, and she, meanwhile, was about to die. She had become incredibly thin, but her face had preserved its really sublime outline and features. Her pallor made her skin look like porcelain, with a light within. Her bright eyes and colour contrasted with this languidly elegant complexion, and her countenance was full of expressive calm. She seemed to pity the Duke, and the feeling had its origin in a lofty tenderness which, as death approached, seemed to know no bounds. The silence was absolute. The room, softly lighted by a lamp, looked like every sick room at the hour of death. At this moment the clock struck. The Duke awoke and was in despair at having fallen asleep. I did not see the gesture of impatience by which he manifested the regret he felt at having lost sight of his wife for a few of the last minutes vouchsafed to him, but it is quite certain that any one but the dying woman might have misunderstood it. A busy statesman, always thinking of the interests of France, the Duke had 1,000 odd ways on the surface, such as often lead to a man of genius being mistaken for a madman, and of which the explanation lies in the exquisiteness and exacting needs of their intellect. He came to seat himself in an armchair by his wife's side, and looked fixedly at her. The dying woman put her hand out a little way, took her husband's and clasped it feebly, and in a low but agitated voice she said, "My poor dear, who is left to understand you now?" Then she died, looking at him. "The stories the doctor tells us," said the Comte de Vandenesse, "always leave a deep impression." "But a sweet one," said Mademoiselle des Touches, rising. Paris, 1839-42. End of section 3. Recording by Nicholas Clifford, Middlebury, Vermont, USA. End of another study of woman by Honoré de Balzac, translated by Ellen Marriage, 1865 to 1946, and others.